Let's see, going live right now. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us as part of our Disruptive Hub on a conversation about rewarding failures and getting results, hosted by Next Evolution Ventures. So I'll start the introductions on my end, and then I'll pass it over to you guys to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this conversation. So my name is Alex. I'm the founder and chief disruptor with Next Evolution Ventures, which is an organization that is aimed at integrating innovation with a diversity and inclusion lens to help build inclusive organizations and communities. So really putting this together was to try and figure out how do we build a collaborative environment where people can come together and have a conversation about things that normally sit at the side of a desk and are kind of like, never really thought about into detail. And it's like, oh, somebody else will do this. Well, we are the somebody that's going to do this. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to whoever wants to take the turn to introduce themselves.
So why don't I just jump the gun? I'm going to go alphabetically. So my name is Charlotte Ray. I currently work at Shopify in talent. And in my short career, I have worked in public sector, so mostly at the University of Alberta. I have a personal passion for diversity and inclusion, and these conversations I find are really important to have. But as Alex said, it's something people usually only do at the very end of their day. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with everyone in a more dedicated fashion.
Absolutely. Well, going in alphabetical order, Charlotte, I guess I can go next. So hello, everyone. My name is Christian Karski. I'm the head of Startup Edmonton, a division of Innovate Edmonton. And honestly, I'm so pleased to be here with you, Alex, Charlotte, and Sonya. It's a passion of mine to talk about the ability to move forward even through failures. And so just a little bit about myself. I actually have 10 years of experience in healthcare. And before I help support the startup community. So it's a very, very exciting time. And, today we're actually celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Innovate Edmonton, where we unite and promote Edmonton's innovators and innovations as a gateway to solving some of the world's biggest problems. And we do this together by really bringing together the public and private sectors, groundbreaking research, and purpose-driven investment to really help build that thriving community. And so Startup Edmonton, a division of Innovate Edmonton, really is a passionate supporter of startup and tech community. It's really about supporting entrepreneurs as they build and grow their tech-enabled products and companies. It's at the heart of everything that we do. So, and you know what, at the end of the day, we know that the founder journey is not easy and it takes a village to raise a startup. And so that's why I'm really, really happy to be a part of the conversation here today to talk about why failure really shouldn't be considered a curse word, a bad word.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonya Vesapatra, and I'm a consultant in Edmonton, and I do work across Canada. I've had a really long career, like 25 plus years. I've worked in public service, nonprofit, academia, and internationally. So all of those amazing experiences have accumulated into the consulting business that I sort of run. And I'm really excited to come today to talk about failure and disruption, because disruption is the only way that concepts like EDI can actually be realized and actualized, I think, because we are so used to sometimes working in ways that we are comfortable with. Sometimes we are afraid to challenge the status quo, and people often are afraid to fail because that's a cultural norm that we are brought up in, right? So how do we take that leap of faith? Like Brene Brown says, dare to lead. Where does this pathway take us, right? So I'm very excited about this conversation and to share this space with Charlotte, Alex, and Christian. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for like a quick introduction and getting us into this. I just want to let the audiences know who are watching live stream from YouTube. It's just the 4 of us that are here on the Zoom chat, but you can be part of the conversation by joining us at slido.com and use the code NEV2021. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible because we'd like to hear what your thoughts are, and we're trying to steer the conversation according to that as well. And if you have questions, there's an opportunity to give us questions out there. So as I start this conversation, I'm also going to give the audience an opportunity to kind of start looking at it is, how does your current environment, so whether it's your work, whether it's home, whether it's social life. Like, let's put it like sometimes failure is not just in the work environment. It's how we parent, how we interact with people, and so on. That environment. How do we currently react to failure? So, um, people on the in the audience, if you can put in your thoughts around what that might be, do so. In the meanwhile, we'll start with Charlotte to give us an idea of what this looks like, and then followed by Kristen and Sony.
Yeah, so failure is such an interesting conversation because I grew up in Hong Kong. And as Sonia, you just mentioned, there are cultural understandings of failure. There is an acceptable way to fail, and there are unacceptable ways to fail. And one of the reasons that I actually moved to Canada was because I was failing school. Like, I'm very honest about this. Like, I couldn't cut it in the local school system, and I wasn't succeeding in a way that was healthy for a teenager to be succeeding. And so those small pieces of failure, like failing math and failing my Chinese classes, made me into a very hardworking person, because then I was told to believe that unless I tried it super, super hard, I was never going to succeed in school. And then I came to Canada, and all of that energy and all that drive, and plus a much more lax, not that school in Canada is easy, it's just more relaxed. Don't want to make that distinction. I suddenly found myself succeeding in school for the first time in a really long time. And I was enjoying myself and making friends, and my mental health was getting better. And there is something to be said as being a teenager and learning that sometimes the environment you're in is forcing you not to fail, but forcing you to not succeed. And I think there is a difference between those two. But that's my own personal perspective. At work, I have failed many times at not keeping my mouth shut. And Sonia and I have some fun stories about that. But I think it's different when you want to disrupt a conversation, and you're at work and you start to have a conversation that makes people uncomfortable. 9 times out of 10, you're going to fail at making other people agree with you. But I'm going to leave it at that, because I bet Sonia and Christian have some very interesting insights.
Are completely on board with absolutely everything. And we talk about failure. I'm like, I have failed every single step of the way. And, it's been tough. Honestly, it's been tough. But failure to so many is really a bad word. And we've been really trained from an early age that it's a gut wrenching experience. Like, I didn't learn how to swim or ride a bike until I was about 8, late bloomer. I didn't get on the basketball team. Whether or not you get fired from your job or you can't get approved for a mortgage, it's been ingrained in us to feel that like it's not acceptable, that failure is not acceptable. And we feel amazing when we succeed, and we feel shamed when we fail. So what do? We sort of naturally do the things we really succeed at, and we don't step outside of the box. It's that trap of the fixed mindset, doing things the same way because they've been done that way in the past. It's because there's a small chance of that dreaded failure. So my favorite saying, and I say it all the time, is that they call it the comfort zone for a reason, because it's comfortable. Who doesn't want to be comfortable? But it's that fixed mindset that doesn't move the needle forward. It doesn't drive creativity, change, or spark innovative thinking. So it's only when you look at failure from a different perspective as a driver for learning and opportunity that you really start to move that needle forward. So I'm the first one to say that, I failed at so many things, but it's been a learning opportunity. But I'd love to hear what Sonya has to say.
Excellent points. I really love that growth mindset mentality, because it's so important to have when you are in a system that really promotes success or failure as two binaries, right? There's no in between often. And it's the in between that allows you for that growth, that disruption, that innovation, that exploration. So, where does that sit with us as we ourselves define what our own success is? I think that when we look at the way society is structured, especially in Edmonton, because I was in Toronto, I came back to Edmonton. I just feel like Edmonton and Alberta are anomaly. But when we look at Edmonton, there's a certain type of person who succeeds, right? There's always this like Joe Alberta, right? So, but I'm like Sony Alberta, born and raised, right? Like, so the thing is that where does Sony Alberta fit in the Joe Alberta spectrum, right? So I think that when we look at an EDI lens, like an equity, diversity, inclusion lens, with the context of success and failure, we really have to look at power and privilege as well. Who holds the narrative and who decides what is successful? And if you always chase after that, I will never succeed because I don't fit that stereotype. I don't fit that narrative. I don't fit that model of success as to what is being promoted as success, right? So actually, I've always failed. Right? Like when I was in school, I was like one of the only brown girls. When I was like going through the system, I'm like sitting in maybe senior policy type of environments, the only person of color in the room, making public policy for Ontario or Alberta per se in my previous jobs, right? So I think that when we talk about being brave and having that sort of dare to lead mentality and that growth mindset, you yourself have to define success so that you don't feel shortchanged by what's going on around you. So I feel like there's both the systems and individual perspective that you have to negotiate as you move through systems navigation to understand what failure is and what success is.
I think that's such an important point, Sony, that like, it's not a binary. It's not you go from one end of the spectrum all the way to failure, all the way to success, but also like there is both a system that defines success, and then there's obviously the individual perspectives on success. And both of those things can sometimes clash and obviously compete with each other, vying for attention in your head, right? Like what you said is so correct. If there is already a definition of success in like the specific field or the specific area you're talking about, then you're running for someone else's goalpost, and inevitably you probably can't get there, right? Because you don't have their specific life, privilege, power, background, education, the list goes on.
Well, I would like to chime in because I love the conversation around the growth mindset and even just getting the experience. Like, I was never allowed to fail. Let me be honest. I was never allowed to fail. Like, I'm obviously Indian origin, but I grew up around the world, and it was this thought process that came in from my parents. Well, I also had the part that both my parents were teachers in the same school that I was at, and to a point that my dad was actually my class teacher at one point in time, and so there was this constant piece around you cannot fail, and the only option was being ranked number one in school, and you have to be good at every single thing, be it sports, be it music, be it academics. It had to be the same thing. And I think uh, when I got out from home and at the age of 18, I kind of got rebellious completely and tried to do everything that was against the system because it was just like holding me back. And that's when all the failures started happening. It's like, yeah, I got kicked out of university for a year. I decided to leave the country and move out. So I'd already been exposed to a lot of cultures, born in Africa, growing up in the Middle East, and but then having a mindset of like, no, you should only follow either being a doctor or an engineer. And then coming out as an architect was never considered an option. And then following that, now stepping into the entrepreneurial world was like totally different. And now I'm getting challenged in the fact of how I parent my kid, like because it's like you're going to set him up for failure. I'm like, well, he wants to play hockey. Why hockey? He's supposed to do soccer or cricket. Like, come on, and so on. So just being able to like even from the personal aspect, like I'm so happy with who I am today because I got to learn a lot from the mistakes that I made because through those mistakes allowing myself to like they were not purposeful mistakes, it happened. Like I was not like, hey, I'm going to get thrown out from university. That was not really intentional. It just happened. Let's do that. And then moving on that journey essentially kind of like dictated like, I'm very comfortable in who I am, how I come across and so on, and it's given me a new spirit about what I want to do in my life, in purpose, and that's what I bring to the work table as well on many occasions. So love this conversation of how it's turning up. Charlotte, you're up.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to ask everyone, and let's just do it popcorn style, answer it how you feel comfortable. But we clearly understand that it's not you can either succeed or you either fail. More than likely, the two are happening in tandem. And we clearly love to reward successes. So, what are some of the barriers that exist to rewarding failures? And it sounds so simple, right? Like just to reward a failure. But what are some of the things we see stopping companies or parents or individuals from doing that?
Well, Charlotte,
I'll go first. Sorry, Christian,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, no, go. Don't you worry. Hit it.
Well, I think the biggest thing is fear. A fear of failure that just comes up. Like there's a huge part around people just we're so stuck with the bottom line being about profitability and success. We don't really have that scope within us to say, you know what, we can fail. And there's that whole like I still call it as a culture where we're still driven through the purpose of that uh, there is a failure. And I worked in municipal government for years, and this is where I see a lot of things because it's a very interesting environment to be in. I think Kristen, you and Sony actually might really relate with this, especially with your roles right now where you're at. It's when you're working with council, there's that whole dynamics of you're serving the people. How can you use taxpayers' dollars to actually try and build an inclusive or an innovative organization when there is an expectation of no, you're going to deliver services in many ways. So I think there is an interesting paradox as well to say, you're stuck in a hard place in certain positions, but I don't think it's impossible. It's about how do you actually build an environment where you can actually put fear in, like look at fear and say we are okay to fail and build that component in there. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers. I've got more, but I'll let everybody else speak on that.
So Christian, you had unmuted yourself, so why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. I completely agree with fear, and I think it comes back down to it's a legacy of treating failures as a negative reflection of yourself. So no matter what, at the end of the day, when you fail, it hurts, it stings, and we've been ingrained to sort of train ourselves to feel that sting and really go down a vicious black cycle where we just continually think about our failures and where we are. So it's a psychological aspect too, that we want to succeed. Succeeding makes us feel good, failure makes us feel bad. And so how do we get out of that vicious cycle?
Oh, you don't have an answer to the how?
Oh. putting me on the spot. I'm just like, it's definitely on top of my mind, and I'm constantly learning about it too, because I am not perfect. I consistently make mistakes. I fail, and oh, don't get me wrong, I still beat myself up about it, and that's not going away. It's a journey to take some of the failures and the mistakes, learn from them, and really be there necessarily, like reward myself and being like, the reward may come a few weeks, a few months, maybe even a few years later, but taking that self-reflection and looking back and saying, okay, I did it, I learned from it.
Thank you. Sony, you and your pink blazer, you've got to have a wonderful anecdote or answer to this.
Yes, actually, I was going to go through like a three, like sort of idea piece. So the first thing is about work, right? So if you're in an environment that promotes psychological safety, that has no gaslighting, like, or very few gaslighting, like, I think you will be able to have the confidence to experiment and fail differently than if you're not in that kind of environment, right? So I think leadership and how people function in a work environment and a work culture is really essential to how people understand and accept success and failure, right? And so that the barrier to me is not having psychological safety. Like, that's a big barrier for that work environment, right? Then the second level is more about, let's say I'm a mother, I have 3 children, right? So for me, it's like my dreams were crushed because my eldest child, when we were little, we went to Switzerland, and I told my uncle to adopt him so he could become a world famous soccer player for Basel. Right? That didn't happen because he hates soccer. Then he started playing basketball, and I'm like, okay, Toronto Raptors, here we come. He hates basketball, so I'm like, okay, he's not a team, but like he's not into like team sports, right? He likes like working out or doing things, but he's not like into that like bro culture. I would say that because I'm his mom, I can say that, right? So to me, it's like, so why is it that then I had to think about like why is it that we promote this in a Canadian context? Like, why is it so important for people to be part of a team sport, to have this team hockey mentality or whatever it is, the sport that we play? Like, I understand it builds skills, but sometimes people are not like that. They have a different pathway, right? But somehow, if you're not affiliated with the sports, I feel like you're seen as a failure by different people too, right? So for me, it's like how do I talk to him then about that perception, but then also working with him to say efforts matter, right? So maybe he has an effort in a different way that is phenomenal, that is going to lead to a success that is not that pathway, right? And he shouldn't be worried about what people judge him on then, right? So, and nurturing that sort of like analysis within him from a young age as he's tweening, as he's moving into life, so that he's prepared with tools to deal with this as it comes into his life, right? Because I feel like it's really hard for parents also to, like, this is the last piece, the third piece about that self embodiment of failure, right? There's a lot of grief, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of regret, there might be blaming, there might be anxiety, there might be mental health issues, because we are, as a culture, like within a capitalistic framework, are taught to like, consume, and like if you have all these things you are successful. But really, if we take a step back at looking at climate change and all these things that are happening, who created that narrative, and why is that the effort of success? I feel sometimes this holds in us, right? Like, how do we dial it back and come back to the basics and what we need as humanity to heal and to be safe so that we can feel? But where is that space? That's the barrier. How do you find that space, right?
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about hearing all three of you speak is that there is an internal component to this. So there's like that internal conversation you have with yourself, as you were saying, Christian, to not beat yourself up. And then Sonia, as you're saying, there is an external component. There's the world, and the world has its influences, and the world has its decisions. And climate change, I can't change that as an individual, but that affects my everyday decision, right? And whether or not I successfully recycle is another attribute I lay upon myself. So even within the external and the internal, there is just this constant fight as an individual to assert yourself and decide, A, what are my own definitions of success? But B, am I ever actually going to reach it? Or is it a definition of success that will set myself up for failure? And then on the flip, being able to say to yourself, but maybe the goal is to fail. So like at Shopify, I've only started for the last couple of months, but one of the things they talk about a lot is antifragility. So this concept of breaking things constantly so that you can figure out how to prepare yourself better for the future. And antifragility is, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So I'm not going to say I'm an expert in any way, but I do like the conversation of let's try to break things, not to see where it will fail, not to see how it will fail, but more or less just to see how we can move past it, how we can succeed past it, how we can, break everything that we know and still be able to survive on the other end of that. And I think that if only that attitude was something we could embody, as you're saying, in people, right? Like how many times have we all worked for someone who says, I totally love feedback. This is a feedback filled team. We're a family. We can say whatever we need to say here. And then you say it, and then you get the cold shoulder for a week and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I couldn't say it. Right. So it's the embodiment of anti-fragility in the individual, in the leader, in that's what's necessary, I think, from my small experiences.
I like you said that because it's true, because I think that's also one of the things that holds us back, like a lot of organizations, because talking about what Christian was talking about was like there's a lot of external factors that also affect your internal clock, as to say, because in an environment where you talk about fragility and you open up and you say things, what automatically tends to happen, and I'm not saying it's all organizations, but most organizations, is what happens is that you suddenly one day you get a message saying so and so employee that talked is no longer with the organization, or that person has been relocated to special projects, or has gone through some, like, so when you start seeing those things based on somebody who's actually opened up and talked about those elements, it internalizes to say maybe the best approach is not to stir the pot or make trouble, because this is going to be an issue. And I think that's a mindset that needs to change constantly.
Yeah, I'll let you have the last word there, Alex. I don't have anything smart to add to.
I think we're, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and on that note, Charlotte, I love the idea of that anti-fragility. How can we move past failure? How can we break through the glass constantly? How do we think about bold new ways, new ideas, and how do we instill that in our thinking, in our methodology? Um, I'm coming back to my comfort zone reference, everyone. They call it the comfort zone for a reason. It's comfortable. I wanna be in a sweater. I want to be on my couch. I want to be comfortable. But just because I'm comfortable, I'm staying stagnant. Nothing's changing. And when we look around at today's society, are we happy with it? Are we happy where we are at today? I want to take a step back just as a quick example of my time in healthcare. And I worked in healthcare for 10 years. So I was knee deep in COVID during these past, it's past 18 months. It's 19, 17 months now. And so COVID has really shone a light on different sectors of our society. Specifically, you take a look from my healthcare lens, seniors and continuing care. And taking a look at how we treat continuing care the exact same as institutional acute care, that it is based off of the same ideology that you have a problem, we can fix it, and then maybe we send you home, right? It's not about that continuum of the healing journey. And so we see that today. And so how do we say that it's not okay? And how do we make that change? How do we start thinking about new, bold, innovative ideas and say we're not going to do things just because they were done in the past and because it worked? But really, did it work? So I'd love to hear your guys' perspective on how we can really start thinking in that bold and innovative way.
So I'm going to call on Sony because I know you have fantastic ideas in relation to this, but it comes back to something you said about 10 minutes ago, which is to disrupt. Absolutely nobody likes to be the person at a party going, hey guys, there's not enough dip for all the chips we have. Nobody wants to disrupt the fun. Nobody wants to stop the flow, right? So with healthcare, we're talking about a solution that was determined very, very long time ago that's no longer applicable to our modern society and needs to change. But who's going to step up and disrupt it and disrupt it enough to likely take the heat? And that's, I think, the trick is like, can you, or more importantly, should you take the heat for just disrupting the regular flow of events?
I love that disruption. You totally hit where I was gonna go, right? Like you know me so well. Um, I think that like let's look at a historical context of disruption, right? So if we look at the civil rights movement, recent global outcomes of Black Lives Matter, sort of understanding that kind of mass disruption because of inequity and inequality in society that leads to other pathways and other understandings of what success and failure can look like in a moment, in a time, in an institution, in a personal journey, and in relationships, right? So I think that it's not always going to look the same. It's not always going to have the same outcome. It's not always going to be in the same box, right? But unfortunately, the way that society and logic models and evaluation frameworks and measurements are put in institutions or academics or the way that we live our lives are put in this very narrow way of understanding success, right? So so how is it that we flip that narrative and recreate different ways of understanding, knowing, and being that doesn't go back to that standardized format of what we are doing, right? And that disruption is hard because people are comfortable, like Christian said, being in their sweater on their couch, right? They don't want to pick up whatever and go somewhere and do something disruptive because it then leads to feeling uncomfortable. Maybe people experience some sort of like violence almost within themselves about why is it that what happened? You know, they can't place that feeling. And we're not taught, I think, especially in North America, to process those feelings and to be okay with them and to know that you can be happy, sad, grief, shame, whatever, all at once, even, right? Like there's this notion that you have to be happy, you have to be steady, you have to be confident, you have to show up, like all these sort of images of who you have to be. Um, I think sometimes diminishes the boldness of disruption, right? And like you said, Charlotte, sometimes when you are invited to be the disruptor, it's not a genuine invitation, right? It's like totally like, oh, you thought that was for real? Like, tone it back, girl, right? Like, you know what I
I,
mean?
my favorite example is in my previous role, I worked at the Career Center at the U of A, and my job was to scan job postings and post them to our student board. And the amount of companies that say they want like a critical thinker, they want that creative solutions. And you think to yourself, do you really want that? Right. And nobody can ask that in the interview. No one's going to an interview going, so you said you want a creative thinker. Well, here I am. What do you want from me? Nobody's ever going to get, they're not going to get very far. But the truth of the matter is, oftentimes you are falsely invited into a space to think critically. And then you point out the problems, and everyone sits around the table and they go, oh, I really don't wanna, right? And they feel emotionally attached, or as Sony says, they're not like processing an emotion that they have with a decision. And the truth of the matter is so much that we do as humans is emotionally powered. But by not acknowledging the emotion that is involved in every decision, we're not letting each other fail or disagree or agree or succeed.
So much is said here that I like, because it was that word about disruption. Because Charles, you mentioned it, like the word disruption is about. It's easy for people to call the disruptor as the troublemaker in many ways, because it's easy to hone in on that one person that's trying to ask the right questions than to actually deal with the environment or the system that is in place. And I think that makes a huge thing. But I think when you look at it, like there are so many companies that are trying to be very proactive. Like I look at Procter and Gamble, they have an award for heroic failure, and Tata has this thing called Dare to Try Awards, and Google X is another one that has that type of like they do awards in places to do that. And I think to the question around being bold about doing it, it takes true leadership to accept that we are going to fail, but I have to say this because there's also a perception that, well, are we going to reward everybody for doing a bad job? And I'm like, no, no, that's not what failure is about. The failure is about how do you have a structured system in place where you can actually fail with the intent of innovating. Like I know we talk about social inequality in a sense, but if you look at the product WD-40, the greaser that's there, the actual 40 comes from 39 failed attempts at it, and that's how they actually named it. Dyson is another one in terms of vacuums, that they had about almost close to about 6,000 attempts at building a vacuum before it became the Dyson that it is there, right? And so those are examples of how organizations or people have chosen to actively fail, and we're not failing. I think it's very clear that we need to be clear about things, is that when we allow failure to happen, it's not about bad performance, or let's not have accountability. You need to have those things. It's just you're creating an environment that's there.
Alex, amazing point. And Sony, one thing that you said previously, a few minutes ago, was that idea of a culture of psychological safety. And so when we take a look at it, for me myself, so personally, I have to give myself the permission to fail. And then we also have to take a look at ourselves as a society, whether it's a workplace, whether it's family. We need to be able to give ourselves and our teams the permission to fail, to inspire a culture of psychological safety, that safety net, that it is okay to not get it right, and to learn from how we move forward. So I think it's starting with those bold new ideas. We have to be able to sort of, again, create that culture where it's okay to think outside of the box. It's okay to try things. It's okay to fail. It's okay to not get it right the first time. But then we also have to be able to sort of get back on the bike and say, okay, it didn't work, so what can? And I think for me, what I don't want to get missed is that failure still stings. It still hurts. But when we create that culture of psychological safety, we create that community, that support system that is there to help catch you.
I love that net. So moving into the last part of our segment, I love this conversation. Um, I think that one of the things that we are all talking about is the iteration of failure, right? Like, how do you iterate? How do you learn? And how do you pick yourself up? And one of the things that I really admire about my children, watching them from being a baby to now, is like their power of imagination, their power of play, their power of being confident and not having anything hold them back, right? Because the school system beats that out of you guys. Right? So my daughter, she's 7 and she's like Miss Diva, and I'm like, keep it going, girl, because I know she's gonna lose it, right? So I want her to have that. So I feel like those are some foundations of promoting a culture where she can fail and feel confident, for example, right? So in your minds, and as we move forward to fail forward, how do you guys feel about like the practicality or application of this concept of failure?
If I can jump in. So my examples are very, very personal, but a year ago, actually a year ago yesterday, because I use a digital journal, a year ago yesterday, I had journaled about how I really felt like I was failing myself in a number of different areas, but one of them being my own career trajectory. I only graduated university in about 2016, so I'm still like fairly new to owning and having a career, but I thought I was failing at it. And yesterday I was journaling again, and my journal gave me the reminder, and I read my previous post, and I was thinking about it today, and I was like, you know what? I had given myself 5 points in 2020 that I was failing on. And this time around, I only had 3. So that's a little piece of success, right? Right? Like, it's not like I made a huge improvement and I didn't change my life in a 180 degree, but at least something small did shift. And I think self-reflection is such an interesting tool for talking about all of this, because right now I feel like I'm failing on a massive scale, but in reflection of what was happening a year ago, turns out there's actually been some change. But I would have not known that if I had not journaled about it a year ago. And there was no way a year ago I knew what would happen a year from now. So that self-reflection piece, especially writing it down somewhere, can be really handy. Like personally, New Year's is coming up. I absolutely love writing a letter to myself that I can read a year from now. It's very kitschy. It's very much my generation, but it is a fun way to see and truly gauge, am I failing, or is it just my perception that I'm failing?
Oh, Charlotte, that hit hard. I absolutely love it. And the fact I'm just like, I say to myself all the time, I'm like, I should be writing this down. I should be. So like, that is something I'm taking away from this conversation. I'm like, Christian, okay, like put it into perspective, take that time to self-reflect. Because I usually just keep it all up in my head and then it just like turmoils and circles and becomes a massive mess. I love it. It's that shift in mentality to sort of say, creating that culture of psychological safety. For me, not necessarily, well, more so along the lines of like a self-example. I think for leading teams, leading my family, and I have to be authentic, and I am not afraid to say that I messed up, or I am like, this was my failure. Like I took it, I approached it in the wrong situation. I'm like, guys, like this is me. So if I'm authentic with not only myself, but with my team members, saying that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay not to think of it right the first time, and listening to different perspectives. I do it all the time. I'm quite open. So I'm like, guys, this may be too much information, but I love that open and authenticity of the fact that like I'm real. I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. I will sometimes speak too much, but it's that authenticity that I think that's key for me.
Interesting. I'm still going to go around the psychological safety piece because I think that's a very key piece to it, is because a lot of it is it comes back to the part about fear in ourselves sometimes to just open up. And I think one of the things that personally that I did was I actually went back to relook at myself, reconnect with myself, and understand where my values were, and kind of went through what my stages of what is something that's acceptable to me. And then when it comes to the work environment or whether I'm parenting or not, it feels more comfortable because I know where I stand in terms of my values and how that fits in to things. And that helps build that psychological safety. I also want to try and talk about it also from the leadership perspective, because I think that's one of the environments that you need to allow for. Even if people are coming with psychological safety, you also need to create that environment where people feel that then there's not going to be problems around failing. Like, let's stop talking about oh, it's okay. But when it comes to actual failure, you have a totally different action to that failure. Like you can still put um, like not barriers, I say boundaries around what it looks like to fail. And then as you start building that confidence as leaders, open up those boundaries. Start small. You can do this in baby steps. Look at it from like your child, yourself. Like they took the first step. They didn't just get up and start walking and running from day one. They got up, they walked, they fell. If you were the person that says, oh, hey, you fell down the first time, so you're never going to walk out again, and that's it, you're never going to get up and move to the next step. So how, like, allow yourself even in the work environment to tread on it in small baby steps as well. It makes a huge difference as you build your organization.
And I
Go ahead.
think, and just to wrap this up in a nice, neat package, like I love the self-reflection, like as a tool. I love the authenticity, like in terms of what does that mean as part of values. So I think those things are really important takeaways for me too. And then the other thing is also dreaming. Like I feel like, in our society, like we're bombarded by so much information, by so much things. We don't allow ourselves, or we're not allowed to rest. We're not allowed to dream. We're not allowed to take time to be proactive about thinking about what we want to think about, right? It's always like reactionary. Oh my God, let's go, right? Like this is how I feel we live, right? So how do we make that time? Because that's part of that self-reflection process. So I feel like those are some amazing tools that we've collectively come together with in this particular space. I'll turn it over to Alex.
Now, I know Charlotte wanted to say something just before Sony came in, so I'll let you speak and then we'll wind up the conversation.
I love having the last word. I think that you had talked about leadership and you're like, how can leaders how can leaders promote and reward failure? And I think the first thing is that we have to start removing shame from failure. And that is really hard. I love the Canadian saying, I think it's North American actually, that snitches get stitches, because it is such a telling, it's such a telling saying. So what corporate workplaces can actually end up like. You fail at something, and instead of your coworker maybe telling you to your face, they tell your boss, who sends you an email and goes, hey, can we have a chat? And then you sit down and have a chat, and then you learn that you've actually made a mistake when you probably could have circumvented the whole situation and avoided the creation of shame if the coworker had simply come to you and said, hey, I think you made a mistake, but that's cool, let's fix it together. So I just wanted to leave it with that. If we just removed shame out of the equation, which is not an easy thing to do, but it would help.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. Any last words from everybody? I know Charlotte wanted to have the last word, but I'm going to give an opportunity to Sonia and Kristen as well to have a last quick words on this conversation, and then we'll wrap up.
First of all, Alex, thank you for bringing us together. I really appreciated the space to get to know Charlotte, Christian, and yourself more. And I look forward to all the disruption that we will create in the city of Edmonton, because I know we're all disruptors. So that is very exciting to me. I found my posse. The second thing is, I really think one of the things that, along with rest, is relations, right? Like you have to build relations to build this kind of culture of psychological safety, of not being fear of failure. And that takes time, right? It doesn't happen in one interaction like today, but hopefully Charlotte and I will go for coffee. Alex and I will meet up. Christian and I can have a meeting. Like I feel like we have to build these pieces so that people can come together to sort of like start emanating these messages, so people can start feeling comfortable applying them to their toolkit.
Disruptive Posse. I'm totally starting a WhatsApp group, and literally that's the title of it. And we're going to be the Disruptive Posse. No, just honestly, just a thank you, a massive thank you to absolutely everyone, Sonia, Charlotte, Alex. It's an incredible opportunity to listen and sit here and have a chat with you as I'm drinking my hopefully last cup of tea for the day. But at the end of the day, like this conversation doesn't stop. We don't just talk about it. We continue it forward. And so I'm just unbelievably happy to be here. I'm old school, so like you can see me writing notes because these people over here are saying amazing things. So like I'm here like writing them down because I'm like, I gotta take this back. Like I gotta reflect on it. So just a massive, massive thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for being part of this. And Sony, we're not just in Edmonton, we're trying to disrupt all through Alberta. as a whole, and that's what we're trying to create with the Disruptive Hub, is to get thought leaders and practitioners from across Alberta. Right now, Alberta, we may be Canada, we'll see later on, but let's start small and grow as we do, because this is important. It doesn't take one person can try something, but it takes a community to come together to build something. And these type of conversations are very key. As you guys said, this is not the end of the conversation. This is just the beginning of such conversations, because it's important to create this safe environment and safe space. Totally about psychological safety, to be able to openly talk about it. And like, even through this discussion, we've come up with potential ideas that I'm sure the audience is going to look like, hey, I'm going to take a step and try and see what can be done on this front. So with that, I want to call a close to this conversation today. But I hope to see you guys around on other conversations. I know Sony's only going for coffee with Charlotte, and she didn't invite us for coffee, but we'll catch her up on some other thing later date. But for the people that are watching, if you want to be part of the Disruptive Hub, go to our website, Next Evolution Ventures. There's the Disruptive Hub, and there's an option to join the Disruptive Hub. Get in touch with me, connect with me, and let's have a conversation on what you bring to the table, because we're growing and we want to come together to build a better community, better organization, better Alberta. So with that, thank you very much, and really love the conversation, and we'll call it a night for today.
Good night.
Take care, everyone.